Thank you for joining us. I'm David Lowe. I'm the with Juliet McMullen. I'm co-director of the Center for Health Disparities Research. I'm also a professor of biomedical sciences with background in immunology, and I'm also the lead on this research project funded by the center on environmental exposures in childhood asthma. And I just wanted to give a little brief introduction to how this project got started. It's based on the observation that asthma rates near the Salton Sea, childhood asthma especially, are about 3 times higher than they are in the rest of California. And so while the high levels of dust have been often pointed to as a cause for the disease, that really hasn't led to a lot of specific action and research and understanding the problem. And our interest was in the fact that although there are high dust levels in other parts of California, such as, say, the Central Valley, as well as other parts of Coachella Valley, the incidence of asthma is not the same as we see near the near Salton Sea. And so a few years back, about 5 or 6 years ago, we had started the Breathe Center to bring together interdisciplinary collaborators to address more general topics on air quality and health impacts. And this became an interesting focus in the Salton Sea issue, and we began some research on that area. Part of that effort was something that Ann Cheney had started, which was to go and work with the community to look at the experiences of asthma and to gain some additional information from the community in terms of what the issues would be. And once we started we're able to get this funding for this project, which has a whole range of interdisciplinary collaborators from climate scientists, ecologists, microbiologists, engineering researchers, as well as biomedical sciences. We set out on this really complex task to try to identify the issues behind childhood asthma in the region, the mechanisms, and a lot of the other issues that could help us understand the disease, the impact on the community, as well as maybe lead to some targets for action. So as I said, it's absolutely wonderful, talented, interdisciplinary team. And I'm hoping the conversation today will get into this really important aspect of working with the community and trying to develop approaches to the research that can further assist us in our biomedical and other related research on asthma in the community. So let me hand this over to Ann, and hopefully get a very interesting discussion going. Thank you.
Okay, so hi, good morning, everyone. I do want to say that if you haven't yet chosen your language line and you're listening in English, I do recommend you choose English as your language line, especially for the next presentation, which will be primarily in Spanish. If you're bilingual, I believe that you can stay on no line, and that way you can hear both languages, or I don't know, actually. Yeah, I guess you hear both languages. So today I'm going to talk to you about our project, Asma Infantil y Laguna del Salton y Lecciones Aprendidas. So I'll present in English, but I want to emphasize that part of this panel is to disrupt how we traditionally think about doing research. And so you can see we're presenting bilingually in English and in Spanish. All of our slides are in English and in Spanish, and we have interpreters here. And that's because we work with several languages for this project. So I am in charge in collaboration with Maria Poser, who is here today. We are in charge of community engagement and public health research that's part of this project. So as David indicated, this project is quite large, and there are a lot of different perspectives and expertise that have been brought together to carry out this project. This is an image of the Salton Sea. So to illustrate the complexity to this project, Here are the different aims. And these aims will be accomplished over 5 years. So the first aim is community engagement. These are, very, very much synthesized and condensed. So the aims are actually much more complex, but for the purposes of this presentation, I want to just give you some insight into generally what this project captures or encompasses. So Conchita, also known as Conchita and I are leading the community engagement, which also includes public health research. Dr. Will Porter, he is leading investigation over the Salton Sea wind patterns. And Dr. Emma Aronson, she is leading the investigation over the collection of dust from the Salton Sea and analysis of its microbiome. And then Dr. David Lowe is assessing the Salton Sea dust on lung inflammation in animal models. And so you can see that the idea, or what I want to point out is the idea is that participant, the community engagement, participant voice, the voice of the community is essentially threaded through all of the different aims of this project. That is ultimately our goal. So the methods del proyecto, or the project goals. So our goal is to collaborate with members of the community living along the Salton Sea, to collect qualitative data to describe the impact of the Salton Sea on childhood asthma, and then to disseminate study findings, including laboratory and public health findings through social media and political networks. So really thinking about, and I want to emphasize, this is the specific goals of the community engagement and public health part of this project. But really thinking about ultimately, how can the things that we're doing in this project, the research activity, the information that we're generating, the research results, how can it then go back into the community and inform practice and policy and public health in the context of the community? And of course, the communities that we're engaging and working in are those living in the Eastern Coachella Valley, many of whom are identify as Latinx. There's also a very large indigenous population of Purépecha, which I will talk a little bit more about in a moment. So this is a broad overview of our collaboration. You can see that we have our investigative team, community academic partnership, I should say. Conchita Maria Posar, she is our community investigator, our community researcher. Here's myself, leading efforts around public health and community engagement, Dr. Porter, Dr. Aronson, and Dr. Lowe. And then here you can see, this is our community advisory board. So we meet quarterly with our advisory board, and they offer advice and input on different aspects of the project, thinking about how can we move things forward, being very mindful of including the voice of the community. So I have to say, I created this presentation in Spanish and English, and I keep just wanting to say everything in Spanish. So my brain is getting a little confused. So I want to emphasize that we are not only doing this research in English and Spanish, we're also doing it in Purépecha. So Conchita is a native Purépecha speaker. She's bilingual in Purépecha and Spanish. And in collaboration with her family and community members in Michoacán, Mexico, which is where she is from, we're able to also translate the work that we are doing from Spanish to Purépecha as well. So the Purépecha community in the United States, specifically in the Eastern Coachella Valley, is the largest, of what we know, it's the largest Purépecha community in the US. At least we believe it is. And Conchita has shared with me some of how her community is able to understand that it is one of the largest communities of Purépecha, identifying Purépecha speaking indigenous community in the US by an annual dance that's called Danza de los Viejitos, which is dance of the old people. And one of the things she shared with me is recognizing the number of young individuals who are involved in that dancing helps them understand the growth of their community and how many individuals are within their community. So this is where Conchita is from, and the majority of individuals in the Eastern Coachella Valley, they are from this particular community in Michoacán, Mexico, Ochumicho. And you can see it's quite far from the Eastern Coachella Valley. This is the Salton Sea right here. So you can get a sense that individuals who are from Michoacán, Mexico, that they are quite a ways from their hometown, but there's still a lot of sharing and communication. And as I mentioned earlier, in this project in particular, anything that we translate is in communication and collaboration with individuals living in Ochumicho. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about today, and this will be a theme that goes through each of the presentations, is the idea about data and timelines. What do they mean, and how do they have different significance based on the vantage point of individuals engaged in the research? So what does the data mean to an investigative team? And I use the term investigative team very broadly to capture that there's many different kinds of investigative teams. So if we were to think of traditional research, then we might think more so along the lines within this paradigm that the research and the data, it's developed by investigators. However, if we think about community-based participatory research, which is the kind of methodology, well, I'm sorry, it's not a methodology, an approach that we are using within this project, then really we think about how data, how research are co-created, and they're designed and developed by communities and academics together. When we think about publishing data, for instance, often a traditional paradigm framework is we publish in scientific journals, and then once accepted, we can disseminate publicly. So that might mean in an op-ed piece, that might mean in a brochure, for instance, to member that might get in the hands of community members. But the gold standard is typically we publish in academic journals. When we think about Cbpr, for its acronym in English, we're continuously sharing information about what we're learning, what we're co-creating together, and how it can be shared within different spaces in the community. When we think about who owns the data, often we think that it's owned by the investigators and the institutions. When we think about Cbpr, we consider the data to be owned by those generating the knowledge. And so that often includes community members and academics. When we think about timelines, this gets a little tricky because we have different vantage points, and that means that we also have different timelines and constraints and expectations that we have to adhere to. So when do we disseminate research? So if we were to think about traditional research within that particular paradigm, we might think that we'll disseminate the research when it's been submitted for peer review, when it's been reviewed, when we've received feedback, and when it's been accepted. And so it flows with a journal cycle, for instance. It also flows with the academic year and the constraints imposed on investigators by often, especially in a public research institute, by perhaps the multiple demands and expectations that they have for other grants or for teaching or for service. If we think about the Cbpr paradigm, we try to think about, well, when is the information actionable? So that could mean that it's not the actual research findings, then maybe it's the process, maybe it's the partnership, maybe it's some initial findings. So whenever it's actionable and it can be used by members of the community for various purposes, which could be advocacy, it could be informing public health policy change, for instance. So our project is really about disrupting traditional ideas of who creates and who owns data. These are some strategies that we're engaging in to do this. One, we have a community advisory board that offers advice and research activity. So Sandra, for instance, who's here, she will, Sandra and Patricia, they will both share a bit of information also along this theme. They are members of our advisory board. So they have participated in, Sandra will share a bit about her experience participating in the collection of data. And Patricia will share a bit about ideas from the vantage point of community of what data, what is meant by data and how timelines are thought about. Another strategy is by having community academic teams address community identified health needs. So our focus on childhood asthma, as David shared earlier, it began years ago. And it really began with the first project that Conchita and I developed together, in which we identified the health needs of community members living in the Eastern Coachella Valley. This included the Purepecha communities in the Eastern Coachella Valley. And the #1 priority that was identified was childhood health. And within that category of childhood health was childhood asthma. And then the last strategy is community members collect and analyze the data, and academics offer support and resources. In the context of the public health research ongoing in this project, Conchita is the primary data collector, and we support her in collecting and analyzing the data. So I want to give you 2 examples of ways that our work is continuously being shared with members of the community and also informing next steps of the research. So this is a dust collector survey that members of the community, they had the opportunity to share their thoughts and where they would like the dust collectors that Dr. Aronson is deploying and using to collect dust samples to study the microbiome. We conducted a survey last summer to get a sense of where would community members living along the sea recommend that we place the dust collectors. And we had members of the community indicate that they really wanted the dust collectors to be in the northern part of the sea, as well as in places where people are living and spending time. They wanted it to be close to the Salton Sea, as close as possible. And they wanted us to consider how can we get dust within the context of the agricultural fields. And then they mentioned how so much of the current dust from the Salton Sea that's collected is often around the West Shore. And so they really emphasized the importance of looking at different areas, particularly around the North Shore. So Dr. Aronson will talk more about this, but this has been really instrumental, this brief survey. And I also want to mention that these data were collected by students and analyzed by students, and then they created, our medical students, they created this report. And the report is in Spanish and in English. So this report has been part of conversations during our community advisory board and has really informed how we're thinking about sharing this and how we're thinking about, or when I say we, I guess that's the collective community academic partnership, but really giving direction to Dr. Aronson in terms of thinking about where could possible dust collectors be placed so that it resonates with the needs and the direction from the community. And then one of the last things that we're working on as an ongoing effort is creating a comic. And the idea of creating the comic is so that we can share information with community members as we're collecting data, as we're going through the process of this 5 years to get to accomplish our aims and get to the end result. One of the things that we heard again and again is, well, when can we have access to the data? And something really important in CBPR is that it's not just data that we're sharing, it's transparency, it's constant communication. And so the comic is intended for us to really demonstrate the various phases of this research project and to share information with community so that they can begin to ask questions and also understand when to expect certain things from our investigative team, from the community academic partnership. And here is our contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I am the academic investigator for AIM-1. Maria Posar or Conchita is the community investigator, and then Adriana Chavez is the program coordinator. Thank you. And now I believe it is Patricia and Sandra who will present.
Muchas gracias, doctora. por la presentación que hizo para miembros de nuestra comunidad y miembros de académico. Muy buenas tardes, mi nombre es María Posar, pero todos me conocen como Conchita Posar. Soy la investigadora comunitaria y quisiera introducir a mis compañeras para que ellas hagan su presentación por 10 minutos y enseguida el público puede hacerles preguntas. Por favor, cada público tenga en mente que va a tener un lazo de 2 minutos o 1 minuto para hacer la pregunta para que podamos todos preguntar. Entonces, muchas gracias, compañera Patricia. Puede hacer su presentación. Y quisiera introducir un poco a mi compañera Patricia. Ella es Patricia Leal, es programa de Asuntos Medio Ambiente con Alianza y residente del este del Valle de Coachella. Entonces, ella se ha comunicado con nosotros porque también es miembro de Alianza, que es una organización que está preocupada por el bienestar, por la seguridad en general de las comunidades rurales. Y es así que nuestra compañera Patricia va a hacer su presentación hoy. Muchas gracias, compañera. Puede hacer su presentación.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días. Para empezar, Patricia Leal y conmigo también está Sandra Ramírez. Vamos a estar presentando. Sandra Ramírez es miembro de la comunidad también del este del Valle de Coachella, al igual que fundadora de Coachella Valley Parents, entonces también ha estado involucrada mucho, no solamente en cuestiones generales y importantes de la comunidad, pero también en esta investigación más a largo plazo. Sahar, si podrías compartir la presentación, por favor. Y con eso voy a hacer mi parte en inglés, pero Sandra lo va a compartir en español su sección. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Sahar, if you don't mind sharing the presentation just briefly. Sandra is also a longtime community resident in the Eastern Coachella Valley and also founder of Coachella Valley Parents. And today she'll also be co-presenting with me specifically on her engagement in the research as well as a community member and advocate. So just a little bit about our presentation, right? As Anne really uplifted, just sharing a little bit in regards to the historical research approach, what we've seen, and not only in the Eastern Coachella Valley, but across California and across, as you think about research and investigation and traditional historical research approach, it has been in a way where specific researchers may apply for a specific grant, come to the community, do their research, think that they have the solutions to the answer, and do their research and then publish. And then where does that information go? Who knows about it? How does it benefit the community? And, you know, because of that historical approach, now you encounter communities like the Eastern Coachella Valley where there's a lot of skepticism, right? A lot of questions of, another research is coming. What is going to be the process? How do we ensure that this process is intentional? And very clearly how Anne shared, really looking and thinking about the community-based participatory approach, right? When we think about community, it's not a second or afterthought, but rather how do we make sure that they are a part, not only about the research or the research question when thinking about grants and when thinking about opportunities in that end, but also thinking about the process. How do we make sure that community members that are being most impacted are a part of the conversation, not only at the beginning, middle, or end, but really throughout the process? Because at the end of the day, it is the community that is going to be impacted. And essentially, these are the answers, or this is the investigation that could potentially encourage actionable solutions when thinking about these larger issues. Specifically, when we think about the Salton Sea in specific, we know that it's a large conversation. There's a lot of issues happening, a lot of different stakeholders that are part of this conversation. Nonetheless, we should ensure that community residents are a part of that voice. When we think about data and what does data mean to community, right? We really want to know, when we think about research, we know that it takes time. we know that within 2 to 3 months, you're not going to have data, or you're not going to have information that is really going to impact or provide recommendations for solutions. We understand that it takes time, but through this process, it's really thinking about what information throughout the process, if this is a 5, 6, 7 year research investigation, how do we make sure that throughout the process, we're able to share this information, right? So I do agree that this goes back to what is data and actionable data or information that can be distributed throughout the process. When community thinks about data, it's definitely coming from the approach as these investigations are happening. What are some of the initial some of the initial findings that could be shared with community? And I think for the most part, it's really lying back again regarding accountability and transparency when we think about these research approaches. So I think to the extent possible, as we think about data sharing and what are some of those findings, we know that a lot of that information is very technical and could be very technical. To the extent possible, how do we make sure that this information is broken down? And with that, I'll go ahead and share it and pass it to Sandra to the next slide. And Sandra will be sharing a little bit more about her experience as a community member, both in research, being in the research space, as well as an advocate.
Muchas gracias, Pati. Buenos días a todos. Pues ya como me presentaron, pues mi nombre es Sandra Ramírez y vivo aquí en Coachella. Los datos importantes para la toma de decisiones es importante para mí porque yo tengo ya viviendo en el Valle de Coachella, en el este específicamente, más de 20 años. Y hasta ahorita yo he visto cómo diferentes organizaciones o diferentes, se han hecho diferentes investigaciones, han recolectado encuestas y no ha pasado nada. Ya cuando preguntamos dicen, no, pues ya se acabó el dinero, ¿verdad? Pero me siento muy orgullosa de que la doctora Cheney haya escogido el este del Valle de Coachella para trabajar, porque esto se está viendo que va a ir más allá de simplemente recolectar datos de nosotros, sino que parece como que sí hay la intención de que se empiece por lo menos un cambio, ¿verdad? Yo sé que las cosas no pasan de la noche a la mañana, pero sí se ve que vamos comenzando con algo positivo para hacer el cambio. Lo que nosotros hemos, en mi experiencia como investigadora en la comunidad, trabajando con la doctora Cheney, ha sido ayudarle a recolectar la información de la comunidad, de los papás de los niños con asma, los focus group, y para mí eso es súper importante, que se tome en cuenta las necesidades de nosotros, la comunidad, porque a veces hay personas que pues sí, son científicos, están educados, tienen su maestría, doctorados y sugieren cosas que nosotros necesitamos, pero nadie más que nosotros los que estamos aquí en la comunidad viviendo el día a día, sabemos lo que necesitamos, ¿verdad? Entonces, esa manera que se han recolectado los datos se me ha hecho una manera que realmente ha sido muy genuina en el sentido de que se está tomando en cuenta lo que nosotros como comunidad pensamos y sentimos. Y esto es pensando que en un futuro ya se decidan hacer qué va a ser el plan para nosotros, ¿verdad? Como comunidad, para aminorar o minimizar el impacto que tiene el clima donde vivimos. Entonces, eso ha sido como nosotros hemos estado trabajando con la doctora, todo el equipo de mujeres. Quiero resaltar que somos puras mujeres, no sé por qué. Tal vez las mujeres nos interesan más los cambios, no sé, no se ofendan los hombres. Pero sí, somos un grupo de mujeres que estamos trabajando arduamente, llegando a lugares donde se están como muy olvidados, como a las personas que viven en el Salton City. Yo recolecté información de ellas sobre sus experiencias de niños con asma. Entonces, para mí es importante que cada persona que vive alrededor de la laguna sea tomada en cuenta su historia, porque nosotros no somos solamente una parte del Salton Sea, sino todos los que están alrededor son también parte. Son familias que viven ahí, son personas con niños y es importante también escuchar y ver cuáles son sus necesidades o sus experiencias. El reto más grande que yo siento que he pasado o que hemos pasado es que la comunidad está igual que yo, ya con un poquito de escepticismo, preguntando de qué va a pasar con esta información que están recolectando. Porque como les digo, por años se ha estado recolectando información y desafortunadamente no se ha hecho nada, no se ha hecho nada. Entonces, creo que ese es el reto más grande, de que las personas están escépticas de compartir sus historias, de compartir sus ideas, sus vivencias, porque porque sienten que va a pasar lo mismo, no va a pasar nada. Y la oportunidad que yo he visto es, pues como dije anteriormente, la doctora Cheney está dando pasos agigantados al formar un grupo de trabajo con el grupo de científicos, que cada uno está designado a investigar de diferentes maneras lo que está pasando en el Salton City, o qué qué estamos respirando, qué es lo que día a día entra a nuestros pulmones, a nuestras casas, y ahí estamos. Entonces, eso es una gran oportunidad para mí, que yo veo, de que no solamente nosotros estamos diciendo qué sentimos, sino también se está tomando en cuenta lo que estamos compartiendo. Entonces, eso es lo que yo les puedo compartir. No sé si alguien tenga alguna pregunta, no sé si ya me pasé de tiempo. Porque yo me puedo
Muchas
seguir hablando.
gracias.
Ok.
Sí, muchas gracias, Sandra y Patti, por presentar. A Sandra, miembro de la comunidad, que es parte de la Junta de Asesores, a Patricia Leal, que es parte de Alianza. Muchas gracias, compañeras, por hacer su presentación. ¿Alguien quisiera hacerles una pregunta a ellas?
Yo quiero hacer una pregunta a Sandra. ¿Me puede escuchar? Ajá, entonces, Sandra, ¿usted nos puede hablar un poquito sobre la recolección de los datos que usted hizo, en particular en el contexto de este proyecto, al menos como la parte anterior con las encuestas?
Sí, yo me di a la tarea de buscar, perdón, quiero compartir el reto que, ay Dios, el reto que se presentó cuando era la recolección de las encuestas, era porque teníamos que buscar personas con hijos con asma. Entonces creo que ahí ya era un reto, porque hay muchos niños, pero pues gracias a Dios no todos tienen asma. Entonces ese era un reto, para encontrar personas que tengan niños con asma y que quieran compartir su información, porque hay personas, nosotros somos una comunidad donde hay muchas personas que no tienen papeles, hay otras personas que pues les han pasado cosas, entonces ya están con ese temor de compartir, de abrirse, de dejar pasar a las personas a su casa. Entonces, la primera pregunta era de, ¿qué vas a hacer con mi información? ¿A dónde se va a ir? Aparte, no solamente era de llenar la encuesta, sino se dio la oportunidad para grabar a las personas de viva voz, que ellos dijeran sus experiencias o que ellos hicieran algún comentario de cómo quisieran ver algún cambio alrededor de su comunidad. Entonces, yo creo que de 10, a lo mejor 8 me daban esa entrevista por voz. Aún así llenábamos la encuesta, pero creo que ese fue como el reto más grande, de que las personas tenían el temor de que su estatus legal, o hay personas que también decían, es que yo tengo otro nombre, bueno, o no tienen una identificación, y como quiera yo aclaraba todas las dudas: no necesitas identificación, no le hace que trabajes con otro nombre, no le hace que no tengas papeles o un estatus legal en este país, nosotros no somos migración. O había personas que luego decían, sí, pero no vengas a mi casa porque aquí vive mucha gente. Entonces, como son personas que por el sueldo, ¿verdad? A veces hay familias, una casa tiene más de una familia, o alguno de los familiares está, vamos a decir, agarrando desempleo, o está deshabilitado, o no quieren que sepan que viven muchas familias en una sola vivienda, porque no quieren ser afectados. Entonces yo los citaba en un parque, o yo les decía, bueno, pues una calle cerca de tu casa. Entonces, se puede decir que fue como los retos más grandes, el temor de la gente, el temor. Y otra cosa que una señora me dijo, pensó que me había mandado a servicios sociales porque me dijo, ya te dijeron que llevé a mi hijo 2 veces al doctor este mes, y yo no, no tiene nada que ver, solamente quiero recolectar la información, cuál es tu experiencia con tu niño que tiene el asma. Entonces, creo que ese fue como uno de los retos. Y la satisfacción muy grande para mí de recolectar esas encuestas fue de escuchar que las personas no solamente se quedan con lo que les da el doctor, sino para mí eso tal vez son tradiciones o es una cultura, es parte de la cultura, pero para mí es más que eso. Para mí es cómo ellos, con el afán de ver a sus hijos saludables, estaban recurriendo a muchas cosas naturales, lo cual, como les digo, eso es parte de nuestra cultura, pero también va más allá, ¿verdad? Cómo el amor de madre traspasa todo y con el afán o la intención de querer ver a sus hijos mejor, pues ellos estaban recurriendo a cosas naturales. Ya después, cuando creo que nada más es de darse a conocer, ya luego la gente misma me decía, tengo otra mamá que también tiene el asma, entonces, y también me di cuenta que tenemos muchas personas que no saben escribir bien o no comprenden cosas muy sencillas como llena la cajita o táchala, no, cosas que tal vez para ellos son muy técnicos. Y me dio un poquito de ternura de ver cómo mi comunidad pues necesita mucho apoyo en ese sentido de cosas muy sencillas que ellos no lo podían manejar. Y lo que también, como les digo, yo traté de expanderme, no solamente las personas de North Shore, Meca, Oasis, yo quise que fueran escuchadas las voces y las necesidades de las personas que viven en el Salton City, la ciudad. Desert Shore, todo allá, porque para mí era importante porque ellos viven muy, muy cerquitas también de la laguna y también son parte de, aunque no sean, yo sé que traspasé fronteras porque ya es el condado de Imperial, pero igual yo siento que tienen que ser escuchadas, esas necesidades. Entonces, mi experiencia fue, como les digo, con muchos retos, pero muy grata porque era con la esperanza de minimizar, amenorar o erradicar totalmente esos factores que influyen para que sus hijos estén pasando por el asma. Y también era un poco esperanzador porque muchos de ellos me decían, ¿y para cuándo van a limpiar la laguna? ¿Y para cuándo ya se va a quitar? Yo no, era esperanzador y comprometedor porque yo vivo aquí en la comunidad y si las cosas no pasan van a decir, ay, Sandra no dijo nada, Sandra no cumplió. Pero sí, gracias. Si hay otra pregunta, aquí estoy para contestárselas. Gracias, doctora.
Muchas gracias, compañeras, por presentar a Sandra y Patty. Pensé que iban a hacer presentaciones divididas, pero ahora quisiera introducir a la doctora Aronson, que es profesora de la Universidad de Riverside, y ahora nos va a presentar ella, porque ella está haciendo la recolección del polvo, que es lo que las comunidades están respirando. Entonces, doctora Aronson, si nos puede hacer su presentación, por favor, y luego pasamos a hacer algunas preguntas.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be a part of this group today, this panel today. It's a very unique group coming together. We're talking about research from a standpoint that is, I believe, novel in a lot of ways, and I hope that our project together, our work together, will not only serve this community, but will hopefully serve as a model for future interactions between scientists and communities. My talk is called Lessons Learned, Community Input on Salton Sea Dust Collection and Analysis. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge several members of my team that have contributed to this talk and to the research that we are performing. I want to acknowledge a postdoc that is working both with my lab and with Dr. Lowe's lab, Dr. Mia Maltz, who's joined us today, who's contributed greatly to a lot of what you'll see today, as well as my graduate students, Talissa Tapasio and Hannah Freund, as well as a couple of other members of my lab, John Batoff and Mark Swenson, who have been performing fantastic work. Everyone's been performing fantastic work in support of this research in response to community input. This is a diagram that outlines the overall approach that my lab is taking to understand one major component of the dust that is being generated by the Salton Sea and the surrounding playa. So we think a lot in my lab about microbial communities. I'm going to call them microbiomes. These are groups of microorganisms where the microbes themselves or chemicals that microbes are producing may in some ways be contributing to the negative health impacts of people who live surrounding the Salton Sea. We have been investigating the sea microbiome itself, which is promoted as sea spray, contributing to the dust or the aeolian microbiome. So that's the microbiome of the air. In addition, we study the playa microbiome, as a lot of the dust is being generated as the sea recedes because it's receiving less water. There's more playa exposed, and that there's nothing holding that material in place, so it starts to be emitted as dust. The overall research questions that we are approaching, really the basic one is, as the Salton Sea dries, does it stress the ecology and cause environmental risk? That's the big overarching question that my lab is trying to understand. There's a few specific questions that we're trying to answer in support of that larger question, namely, what is the microbiome of the Salton Sea? When does it change? What's the microbiome of the drying playa? And what is the microbiome of the local air or dust that people are breathing in as they go about their daily lives? And does it change over time or with season? And then there's another piece to this, which is through our collaboration with Dr. David Lowe, thinking about what's the normal condition of the lung microbiome and whether it's impacted by environmental stressors or the actual microorganisms of the air or the dust. So to perform this research, we have been, for the last couple of years, using passive dust collectors. And this is what they look like. They're essentially bundt pans, like you would bake a cake in, that are filled with marbles that are suspended from the bottom of the pan with netting. And these are based off of a design from Meredith Reheis, a researcher with the US Geological Survey a few decades ago, that the idea behind it, it's lifted up off the ground so that you're not getting local movement of dust when you just walk right by the collector. And it allows for dust to fall in and then get trapped between the marbles. The approach that my lab then takes is that we rinse all the marbles and we take that water that contains dust, we filter it. We do the same with salt and seawater when we investigate that, those types of samples from the sea. And then we extract the DNA and understand the microbiome through analysis. We also try to understand what kind of functions the microbiome is performing and what kinds of compounds it could be producing that could be potentially harmful. The extracts from the dust, so that when we filter the dust, what filters through, leaving the whole microbes behind, but taking with it all the chemicals that are already in the dust, or the seawater for that matter, then are used for exposure trials of mice to try to understand what kind of impact on the health of an organism the dust might be having. And so heading into the first couple of years of this research, we had 5 locations for these passive dust collectors. And the reasoning behind the choice of these locations is a combination of wanting locations close to the sea and wanting locations further from the sea and in population centers for comparison. So we have, I hope you can see my mouse here. There's 3 locations close to the Salton Sea, as well as 1 within Palm Desert in an urban location. And while you can't necessarily tell from the image here, this is what we consider more of a control location. It's around the bend of the mountain, the Cintos, and therefore it's not receiving much dust directly from the Salton Sea. And through working with Ann Cheney, Adriana, Conchita, and others involved in the Community Advisory Board, and through the tireless work of those study and survey responses that we've already heard about, we learned where the community thought it would be best and most beneficial to have more dust collectors. So this is a heat map describing those responses. And so right now we are in the process of working with community members, partners within the community to locate areas within this region, especially where you can see the hottest region. The red areas are where most people believe that there should be dust collectors. So we're working to find locations that we can have access to put our collectors so that we can collect dust in areas of community concern. And so based on this heat map, we've now been working, we've selected 5 potential locations. As you can tell, these 4 are directly within the red areas of the heat map around the northern and northwestern end of the Salton Sea, an area of concern because many people live in this area and are having these health effects, and an area that we had not been accessing through our current dust collector placement. In addition, there's a location down on the southern end to southwestern end of the sea that's immediately adjacent to some of the palm plantations and agricultural installations that are close to the Salton Sea, which are areas where many local residents work and have concerns about chemicals from agriculture, as well as the sea producing dust and the playa producing dust. So we want to get a sense for the relative contributions of potential harmful compounds from not just the Salton Sea, but also from the agriculture surrounding. And so the placement of this location will assist with that inclusion. We also are working to include additional streams of data, so additional ways of collecting air and dust samples for analysis in response to community concerns. So on the left is an image of the different chambers of an active air sampler. So an active air sampler would allow us, instead of leaving our passive collectors for long periods of time to collect a little bit of dust each day over many days, and then be collected every month or several months, these active collectors can collect large samples within just a few hours. What's wonderful about that approach, the community has expressed that they would really like to see collections done at schools. There's a lot of concern about the exposures in and around school locations near the Salton Sea because children are getting sick and they want to know what their children are exposed to in these areas. And it's very difficult to set up passive collectors that are left over long periods of time at a location like a school because you know, humans are curious. We want to know what's going on in a bunt pan on the top of a pole. And so it's not necessarily something that people would just leave alone to passively collect its dust over time. So instead, this will give us the opportunity to collect large amounts of material that directly reflects what the exposure is at these school locations. In addition, on the right is an image of a wearable dust collector. We might use this model, or we're actually trying to decide if we can design our own wearable dust collectors that would be more directly applicable to the research that we're performing, such that we would be able to work with community members who could wear these active collectors. It's relatively simple. It's a pump and a tube and a filter, essentially, and then have the sample that's taken directly reflect the exposures of the community members themselves. This is another thing that had been expressed by members of the community, that they'd like to see what is the exposure of themselves, of their children, people working in agriculture, people working inside of schools, etc. So this is just describing what I went over just now, just that these active dust samplers and wearable samplers will allow us to more directly collect samples that reflect community interest. In addition, we also are considering how we process and analyze the samples that we're collecting. There's the potential to generate data that's more directly responsive to community interests and needs than we had previously planned. In addition to the data that we had previously planned to generate about the microbiome, we're starting to consider what types of data would be useful to the community on a shorter term basis. The microbiome data, it's a long multi-step process in order to understand what's in the sample and what the impacts might be, and then test whether those impacts are relevant to the health concerns, there might be data we could generate on a shorter term from these different samplers that would be directly of interest to the community. And so we're working to generate those data streams as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about this today. And I believe now we're entering the general question period.
¿Y Conchita?
Gracias, doctora Aronson, por su presentación. Muchas gracias también al público que no está aquí, el que escogió los lugares donde podríamos poner los recolectores a todo nuestro equipo de trabajo. Verónica Martínez, ¿tiene una pregunta?
Sí. En el área de Salton City no se va a poner ningún recolector.
Doctora Emma.
So Emma,
Yes?
in Salton City, could there be a dust collector?
So absolutely. So these are the first 5 locations that we've identified. The idea is that over the next few years, we'll continually add collectors still in response to the survey and any future surveys and work that we do with the community. So currently, these are areas that are of community interest that also we believe that we will be able to have access to these locations. I didn't go into those details, but that's what we're still working out. And over time, we'll try to add to that list of locations, including Salton City. Salton City is certainly of interest to us and in response to the community.
Yo había dado unas locaciones, no sé si no eran accesibles o no les funcionaba para la investigación.
Sí, Verónica, disculpa, Emma. Sí estamos mirando esas locaciones, las que son de Salton y Desert Shore, todas las locaciones que usted nos proporcionó. Incluso usted está dispuesta a prestarnos un terreno en su comunidad, y yo creo que ese sería el mejor, porque en ese terreno no vive nadie y lo que no queremos es que haya personas al lado de esos recolectores. Pero sí tengo entendido que sí tienen en mente algunos lugares de Salton, sí. No sé si estoy bien, doctora Emma. Sí, ok.
Yo creo que
Gracias.
sí.
Gracias.
Sí, Verónica, estamos a paso de tortuga, pero ahí vamos. Está un poco concluso esto, pero sí los tenemos en mente, no se me preocupe, y estamos, de hecho, este mes estuvimos trabajando en esas áreas de su comunidad. Tal vez la doctora Emma todavía no tiene información porque nosotros le estamos pasando la información a base como ella también nos los está pidiendo. Pero muchísimas gracias por su pregunta y le agradezco mucho que esté aquí. Y quisiera hacer una pregunta yo directamente a la doctora Emma. ¿Qué he aprendido? Hemos aprendido mucho, muchas gracias de nuestro equipo. ¿Cuál fue una de las conclusiones más importantes del estudio? Tal vez no sabía antes y ahora sabe. Doctora Emma, ¿qué fue lo que usted está aprendiendo más de nuestra comunidad que a lo mejor usted pensaba y ahora está en conclusión que sí está o ha descubierto algo más?
That is a very tough question to answer. I appreciate it, Conchita. That's making me think pretty hard. So I'll answer on 2 levels. In terms of data we've been generating, well, this isn't a data-based presentation. We have been surprised at some of the microbial groups that we're seeing in the salt and seawater and in the dust, and we're trying to understand what kind of impacts they might have. So we're excited that there'll be some interesting or surprising data we can share with the community, hopefully in not too long as we work through our pipeline of analysis. In addition, through the process of working together, I guess what surprised me, and I mean, I hope this doesn't sound too naive, but just was how much interest there was in giving input on the scientific approach from the community. I didn't know. I've never done a research project like this that was partnered with the community, and I didn't know how much interest in giving input there would be. It was a really pleasant surprise. It continues to be. There's just such amazing active and participatory community members that I think in the long run are going to make this study more impactful broadly, not just in the scientific community, but more broadly to the people whose lives it impacts. And that it's been surprising, and it's been humbling, and it's really made this a dynamic and interesting project. And I hope that continues.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Emma, por esa respuesta que nos hace sentir un poco muy acogedor, porque eso es lo que nosotros hemos estado queriendo desde hace mucho, que los investigadores se involucren con la comunidad y que nosotros los podamos seguir hacia su trabajo. Y muchas gracias. ¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta? Tenemos todavía 8 minutos. ¿Alguien tiene otra pregunta antes de que se nos acabe el tiempo? Creo que tenemos una pregunta en el chat y dice, tiene mucho sentido. ¿Usted piensa lograr expandir este tipo de proyectos colaborativos en otros laboratorios o proyectos?
Yeah, I think I'm looking at the same question in the chat. I think, I think in the next year or so, it'll be really interesting to work with Anne and Conchita, and hopefully Patricia and Sandra as well, and Adriana, of course, who can't join us today, but who's integral to the project, to try to decide how to disseminate the process and the findings from this process with the community to the scientific community. I do think that this can serve as a model for researchers doing science at the nexus of community concerns and environmental issues. And I think that there are journals that would help us to disseminate this in a way that scientists would hear, because I think just as much as it's important for us to be responsive to the community and in this project, make sure that we are sharing what we learn with the community. I also am realizing that a lot of scientists like myself, before I started this project with this wonderful group, they don't even have an awareness that it could be of interest or something that could that it could be done. And so I do think that there's ways for us to share this experience and this process so that other scientists and other labs and other research projects can learn from it and build their own community engagement the way that we have.
Muchas gracias, doctora Emma, y gracias a Jennifer por hacer su pregunta. Tenemos otra pregunta de María Rossi, pero está en inglés. ¿Sí me pueden ayudar, por favor? Mia Rossi.
So the question is for me and Conchita about the parameters for determining a timeline that is actionable for community members. So this is a very difficult one, but some things that we've already begun to do. For instance, we created one of the PowerPoint slides that I had shared with you is an overview of different parts of the project. And this is something that we created within the first year to be able to share with members of the community to give a better understanding of what our project fully entailed, all parts. In addition, we have the opportunity, and David just shared this in the chat, to invite members of the community to also be involved in data analysis. So for instance, Conchita has collected, she's conducted 4 focus groups and I believe 18 one-on-one interviews. And we're now in the stages of getting ready to analyze those data. And there are some members of the advisory board who are here, like Sandra, for instance, who has the capacity to join us to be able to analyze those data. So there are different ways that members of the community can be involved in learning about the data and inform us about how we can share those findings in a way that's meaningful. And I think having community members be a part of the data analysis is helpful for us to think about, well, when is the data actually actionable? When can that data be used in the community and for what purposes? ¿Y Conchita? ¿Usted quiere agregar algo?
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Ann, por su traducción y gracias a Mia Roisey por hacer esa pregunta. Tenemos una pregunta del doctor Lowe. Está en inglés, doctora. Si usted me podría ayudar en esta pregunta.
Sí.
Well, it was not as much of a question as a comment that, as we gather the data, some of it will be fairly complicated. And I think part of our job is to not just say, here's the results, but to train people in the community to be able to interpret what we're saying and also to be able to communicate it further to other members of the community. And I think we are only beginning to start that process.
Muchas gracias, doctor Lowe, por su respuesta y su muy buena respuesta que me hace sentir a mí un poco mejor para poder pasarle la voz a mi comunidad. Entonces, tenemos todavía 3 minutos para alguien más que quiera hacer una pregunta para la doctora Aronson, la doctora Cheney, doctor Lowe, para Sandra o Patty, antes de terminar nuestra sesión.
Lupita, perdón, Conchita, yo quería contestar una pregunta que surgió después de que Patty y yo hicimos la presentación, y esta era de Rubí. No sé si todavía está Rubí con nosotros, pero igual la voy a contestar. Dice, ¿cuál fue una de las conclusiones más importantes del estudio? Pues la conclusión que yo di, no soy la investigadora, no soy la académica, pero lo que yo vi basada en mi experiencia en la conexión con la comunidad es de que pues existe mucho el miedo, el temor de llevar a los niños al doctor por temor de tener represalias por parte del sector salud, de que si el niño se les enferma muy seguido, y también pues igual que hay mucha necesidad y mucho miedo por parte de la comunidad. Y luego también esa misma pregunta dice, ¿qué es lo que que tal vez no sabía antes y ahora sabe y gusta compartir? Pues eso mismo, de que hay muchos niños con asma, y lo que sí descubrí gracias a la doctora y a los investigadores, que es un tipo de asma diferente al asma regular. Entonces eso también es lo que nos hace como únicos, porque no es un asma regular, es un asma, no, corríjame doctora si es que dijeron que era un tipo de asma como inflamatorio. Y también lo otro es de que hay una falta de comunicación por parte de los doctores con los padres, porque hay niños que les están dando medicamento para el asma, pero no les están diciendo, tu niño tiene asma. Entonces esa es una falta de comunicación por parte del doctor hacia el paciente, los padres. Y lo otro también es de que hay personas o más bien los doctores no les hay niños que tienen asma y los doctores no los están medicando como tal. Entonces hay un poquito de falta de comunicación por ese lado. Gracias.
Sí. Doctor Lowe, ¿tiene una pregunta?
Well, I wanted to answer Sandra's comment. We are hoping that we can begin clinical studies on the kids. It's been difficult right now because there are, even though we have pediatricians working in Coachella Valley, there are so few, because of the pandemic, there are very few actual in-person patient visits, so it's difficult to do this kind of work. But there are a couple of points I'd like to make. One is that doctors are prescribing medications, and we need more careful look at whether or not the medications actually have benefit to the kids. And I think that's one thing we need to study. If they give them an inhaler, we need to follow up and say, does it actually help? the thing is, if it works, then, you know, regardless of what the actual mechanism or kind of asthma it may be, if the drugs have benefit, then we're still doing the right thing. The question of what kind of asthma or what kind of disease is in some ways more of a concern to the scientists and maybe less of a concern to the children and families if the medications work. On the other hand, if we understand the cause of disease and say, maybe we can find better ways to treat it, or even find ways to address what the problem at the Salton Sea is that may be the cause of the disease, well, that could be very important to everybody. So I think there's work to be done, and I'm glad we're able to communicate with the communities to discuss these things, because we want to be able to contribute to the advocacy and talk to legislators, you know, agencies that are not doing the work they need to be doing, but maybe we can help instruct them on what really needs to be done.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Lowe. A los organizadores tenemos otra pregunta. ¿La podemos responder?
Yeah, so let me just go ahead and read. This is a comment and question from Dr. Wilson. I believe one key to action research, including CBPR, is moving beyond analysis to intervention. If the dust turns out to be a major driver of asthma incidents, are there community, ecological, policy, individual interventions that are already being imagined and considered?
I think Patty probably has some good comments on that, because there's been a lot of frustration in the community. I'm sure Patty can relate that, that they've been asking for action and it's not. Anyway, let Patty address that.
Yes, I think that's a great question. And I think it requires much more thinking and brainstorming in coordination with the researchers as well. For a long time, the approach or the way that policy and stakeholders had been looking at this issue around the Salton Sea is from an ecological lens, but not necessarily from a public health lens. And I think that this is the reason why when we think about solutions or possible policy that can really come and intervene, it's very hard for these key stakeholders to think outside of ecological solutions. But I think for us, is as we see and as we think and see the impact of the dust really having on public health and community members that live around it, is really thinking about that public health component. What are some possible projects that can be implemented right now, short-term and long-term, that ensures that it's addressing at least to the very minimum, mitigating these public health concerns. And in the long run, some of the ideas or solutions that have been thrown out is knowing that the Salton Sea is something that is going to be here 10, 20 years out the line. So how are we responding to this, knowing that there's already public health concerns? In the area, there's no hospitals, no nearby hospitals that could potentially be addressing or mitigating these issues or concerns from that asthma perspective or respiratory health perspective. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity to really think outside the box and really bring in interventions and solutions that will look at it not only short term, but really thinking about long term. When we think about the needs of the area, some of the ideas when thinking about community is approaching it through a multi-benefit approach. Basic resources are limited. So really taking this opportunity to envision a bigger and stronger Salton Sea area around the Eastern Coachella Valley. I know that some conversation has been a lot around lithium. I think for community members, when we think about solution, is not creating additional harm or creating additional health issues in the area, but really thinking and imagining what are sustainable solutions that will benefit community members living in the area, and possibly also ensure that there is not possible that communities can really thrive within this environment.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Muchísimas gracias, Patti. Ya terminamos nuestro tiempo. Nuestra compañera ya nos va a sacar en unos minutos porque nos pasamos 5 minutos. Solamente les quería hacer la invitación a nuestra siguiente presentación, que también es por parte de miembros de la comunidad de COVID Staff. Hicimos una investigación sobre el acceso a las pruebas de COVID y eso va a empezar a las 10:20. Muchísimas gracias a todos nuestros espectadores que nos acompañaron. Les pido una gran disculpa de si he hecho algunos errores. Es que no estoy en casa. En mi casa no tenemos electricidad desde el miércoles y estoy un poco extraña en un lugar, pero muchas gracias a mi compañera Patti por ayudarme y muchas gracias. Que tengan muy buen día y disculpen mis errores, por favor.
Muchas gracias a todos y Conchita y a todos. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Gracias.